for this session. And the first presenter is Dr. Yee Mun Lee, and she's also my lovely supervisor. And she's currently a senior researcher fellow at the Institute of Transport Studies at University of Leeds. And her research interests include investigating the interaction between automated vehicles and other road users. The topic she will share with us today is, are you yielding for me or not? The role of the Kinematics information and eHMI. Thanks, you can share, share the screen now. Okay.
No, I think I need to unmute myself first. Can you hear me now? Okay, that should work. Great, thank you. All right, so yes, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm Yee Mun, and okay, there we go. So I'm not going to repeat the topic that I'm going to be talking about today. So I see lots of familiar faces here, so please forgive me if some of the information that I'm presenting is repeating information for you, but I guess it's good for us to recap in terms of state of the arts as well. So clicking next, but it is not going to the next slide. Okay, hopefully this works now. Right, so as you can see, there is a lot of interactions going on the road, and there is, many different ways where two agents or two road users are going to be interacting with each other or encountering each other. And interactions is a situations where the behavior of at least two road users can be interpreted as being influenced by the possibility that they are both intending to occupy the same region of space at the same time in the near future, and that's what interaction is about. So there is a lot of behaviors that we're able to observe on the roads from the road users, and they have different purposes, and we have categorized all the purposes that can be observed on the road. Right, so we started our work in trying to observe what is going on in the current interactions between road users. And a lot of studies, not only ours, basically found that we typically use the behavior of the vehicle to help making the crossing decisions. Basically, you can see that, road users pretty much just move around each other, and there isn't much of the explicit communications that we are able to observe. So this is the study where we observe in 3 different locations, in Leeds, in Athens, as well as in Munich. And it seems like road users rarely use explicit communication. Well, at the very least, in this kind of 50 kilometers per hour junctions or interactions that they encounter each other. But in other situations, so for example, parking scenarios that we also observed, then we found a bit more that kind of non-verbal communication during interactions, where if people are looking to each other, then it affects who actually took the priority. Right, and then we started looking at work in a more controlled manner, trying to understand what kind of information, explicitly or implicitly, how people use that kind of information to make crossing decision. And one of the patterns that we observe a lot is called the bimodal crossing pattern, where pedestrians either crossed when the vehicle is very, very far away, or they wait until the vehicle comes to a near full stop. They rarely crossed when the vehicle is still decelerating or in between the distances. So that's what we call bimodal crossing pattern, which I'll be talking a bit more later. And then in the future, we know that if the vehicle is automated, then the onboard driver or user are free to do anything. So they can do any non-driving related tasks, which means they will be looking very, unattentive, or they don't have to be attending on the road, or they might not even present, depending on how the seats positions are going to be like in the future, right? So we investigated how the presence as well as the attentiveness of driver affects crossing experience as well as crossing behavior. So we found that crossing initiation time was longer in the distracted driver condition. So if the driver actually looks distracted, then pedestrian took a bit long time to decide to cross. And participants also had a higher perceived risk when they're interacting with a distracted driver or no driver condition. They also have a lower perceived behavioral control. So it seems like, how the drivers appear to be like actually do affects people's crossing experience, as well as how long it takes them to cross the road. So there's a bit of hesitations going on as compared to when they're interacting with an attentive driver. So that's why, that's basically, to remind everyone why we have all these eHMI concepts, which is trying to solve the problem where there's no onboard driver, there's no hand gesture, and so on. So there's various concepts came up in the past. You have eye concept, you have smiley face, which all trying to say, I've seen you, I'm yielding for you, I'm decelerating, please cross. Various kind of messages, and that's what we have different concepts. And lots of researchers have also found that eHMI are beneficial in many ways. Generally eHMIs are very informative and preferable. They make people to cross quicker, so people less hesitate to cross. They improve the comfort, trust, acceptance, receptivity, and perceived safety. So it improves subjective feelings of crossing as well. And percentage of feel safe to cross increased, and more pedestrians crossed when eHMI was present, and willingness to cross increased. So, but there's still lots of unanswered questions. So in Leeds, we did a series of experiments, and we want to understand how a novel eHMI is as compared to a flashing headlights as a benchmark. So a flashing headlights is a familiar kind of eHMI that we have seen on the road now. So that's how slow pulsing light band looks like. So it's a 360-degree light band, which is slow pulsing. And then there is a flashing headlights, as you can see clearer, the reflections on the road. So we basically compare these two messages or these two eHMI without telling people what the message intend to convey, right? So on the right-hand side, you see this figure, and on the y-axis, you saw percentages of crossing. So the higher it is, the more people crossed. And then on the x-axis, you see the distance of the vehicle from the pedestrians when crossing was initiated, right? So you see this high peak here as well as a high peak here. So that's what we call the bimodal crossing pattern. So people either crossed when the vehicle is still very, very far away, say 42.5 meters away, so very, very far away, or they wait until the vehicle comes to a near stop, then they cross. So that's called the bimodal crossing pattern. But what you can see here is that there's this little bump, a little increased in crossing, a very distinctively different black line. And what we are seeing here is indeed when the flashing headlights is being switched on. So when the flashing headlights is being switched on, then you can see that there's slightly more increase in crossing, even though the vehicle is still moving and decelerating in this particular scenario, and they don't necessarily have to wait until the vehicle comes to a full stop, which means, in this case, the flashing headlights is more effective as compared to the slow pulsing light band. As you can see in the gray solid line, there isn't much of an increased, even though people have seen the slow pulsing light band. So the stars indicated the positions of which the flashing headlights is being seen, as well as the slow pulsing light band being seen. Even though they are significant, but you can see that when people seen the flashing headlights, there's immediate increase in crossing, but people seen the slow pulsing light band, yet there's no increase in crossing. So that shows us, how the difference between a novel eHMI as well as familiarity of the eHMIs affects crossing, as well as perception, perceivability of the eHMI. So we want to understand how that change across blocks. So if people have encountered, many times, does that actually affect people's behavior? So as you can see in the block one, there is an immediate effect of the flashing headlights, right? But there isn't much of what's going on in the slow pulsing light band. But in the block two, then you can see that there's a slight improvement. People start to react to the slow pulsing light band a bit more. The same in the block three, but they never gone as far or as effective as the flashing headlights. So that's what happens. People do learn, and there is people start to react to the explicit communication despite not knowing not being told explicitly what the message is about. But still, it never gone as far. And this study has 144 trials. So in each blocks, there's quite many trials going on. So despite encountering the same eHMI many, many times and with a very consistent behavior that doesn't seem to massively change how people react to the approaching AV. Right, well, especially at lower time gap and speed, we know that pretty much. Right, so we want to know what's going to happen if you have provided a series of functioning eHMI, which means eHMI, decelerate, stop, eHMI, decelerate, stop. But what if in a trial where you presented eHMI, but the vehicle is actually not decelerating, but going at a constant speed? So what you're seeing here on the right-hand side is that these are the people who have entered the road when the eHMI is there, but the vehicle is not decelerating. So as much as 35% of the trials that people have actually made the judgments based on explicit communication after a series of functioning eHMI without looking much into the kinematics information. They did improve in the second failure trial, which is what we call them. But still, there's quite a few people collide with the automated vehicles. And in this particular situations, it also decreased the comprehension as well as trust, as well as increasing the risk perception, which is what we want to avoid, right? So that's not very nice to see. So we started going on into investigating a bit more of a different, innovative scenario where we know that a lot of decelerating vehicle on the road does not necessarily mean that they're yielding for you, right? They can be just decelerating for any other reasons, or it might just be a traffic jam going on. So that's what we want to investigate. So on this top picture here, it's the viewpoint of the pedestrian before crossing the road, looking at the left-hand side where there's red lights and there's two vehicles already, stood there waiting for the red light to turn green. On the right-hand side, you again see two approaching vehicles, and the task is to judge whether to cross in between the approaching vehicles or not. So the approaching vehicles always decelerating. It's either that it decelerates to stop and join the queue on the left-hand side of pedestrian, or it's actually decelerating to yield and stop before the crossing line. So that's what pedestrians have to discriminate, whether the decelerating approaching vehicle on the right-hand side is for them or actually going to go past them and stop at the traffic light. So we also tested slow pulsing light band and the flashing headlights in this scenario because we want to see how that affects people's judgment again. So people take shorter time to decide crossing when the vehicle is yielding for them than for the traffic lights, which is good. People are able to discriminate based on the intention. CRT was also shorter when flashing headlights was presented as compared to slow pulsing light band and no eHMI, which is in line as the previous study that I've mentioned. Again, no surprising, replicated findings, very good. Oh, there we go. And then more collisions actually happened again when flashing headlights was presented than slow pulsing light band and no eHMI. So that finding is an extension to what we found previously. So in the previous study, we already told people what slow pulsing light band means, the one that people actually collide with the failure trials. So in this one, we did not tell people what the message is trying to convey, but again, when people are more familiar with the eHMI, they cross quicker. They also have more collisions when the vehicle is actually not decelerating for them, which is what we want to avoid. And learning effects was found. So towards the end of the trials, people start to not trust the eHMI or in this case, flashing headlights as much as they do in the beginning of the trial. So they start to use a bit more kinematics information and not trusting the explicit communications that is being given by them to them by the automated vehicles, which it's good that people learn, but we don't want people to not trust the explicit communications being given by the vehicles, right? So that's basically this study provide us an implication or a portray to the future what's going to happen when the novel eHMI become familiar, because one day the novel eHMI will become familiar, right? So that's what happens, and we want to avoid them. And then in another study, we're looking at a bit more of a cross-junction situations where vehicle can come from two different locations. In this study, on the left or on the right side, and we also tested the slow pulsing light band or without the slow pulsing light band. There's no flashing highlights in this because we've done enough understanding between the novel and familiar message, and we have investigated the zebra crossing versus non-zebra crossing. So looking a bit more into the cross junctions as well as how infrastructure actually play a role in addition to the explicit and implicit communication. And in this situation, we also have the kind of edging behavior that we have observed in our previous studies in the on-road observations, where the vehicles just slowly edge towards the crossing lines to also indicate I'm actually yielding, I'm not going to go past you. So vehicle kinematics was the most important source of information. No surprising, but it's great to see the kind of replication, followed by the traffic infrastructure. People are more likely to cross when the vehicle is yielding versus non-yielding, as well as more likely to cross when there is a zebra present as compared to when there is no zebra present. And eHMI appears to have the most important impact when there is no zebra crossing present. So when there's zebra, the eHMI present or not present actually did not make much of a difference. So only when there is no zebra crossing, so there's no kind of infrastructure. So again, it kind of shows us that the eHMI is more useful in the kind of no right-of-way situations or a bit more ambiguous situations. And when there is zebra crossing, people use that to make their crossing decisions instead. Right, so what do we know now? Vehicle behaviors are important. We've found this again and again, regardless of whether it's on simulator studies or on-road observation. eHMI is good, well, in a way that it decreased the CIT and improved pedestrian subjective feelings while they crossed. If we make sure that people do understand what the eHMI is conveying, as well as familiarity, as well as the visibility of the eHMI have to be ensured. We need to consider traffic environment, because there are some situations where eHMI is more useful than the others. And eHMI failure or miscommunication has to be taken very good care of, because we don't want situations where it either collides with pedestrian or other road users, or situations where it actually people starts to not trust the explicit communication is being given by the vehicle, because what's the point of it then? Think a bit more about long-term effects, how people adapt their behavior, how people learn this kind of information, and how people are going to change their behavior when times goes. Right, looking at more realistic, complex scenario, different situations is what we should do in the future. Long-term effects, inclusiveness, I've probably talked about this many, many times now. Looking at different culture, disabled, older participants, cyclists, as well as other cars, there are less research as compared to pedestrians. Looking a bit more into the interaction kind rather than reaction. So using simulators that they are pedestrians and the drivers are actually interacting with each other. So there will be some papers coming out from our group. So pay attention if you're interested. As well as taking more into account of the ability or the capability of the sensors when it comes to investigations, as well as manipulation of our study is important. We also started looking into different metrics, such as how people rotate their head, as well as eye tracking to gather information. So again, those are references, which hopefully be helpful. And that's the end of my presentation. Sorry if I've gone over time. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Yee Mun. And it's the Q&A time. Any questions from the audience on site and online?
Okay, may I ask one question? Yeah.
I have a question. Excuse me. Yeah. Hi, Yee Mun. Actually, I did eHMI work last year, but maybe my idea is a little bit well. I will know the problem between the AV and pedestrian, but sometimes if we can make the pedestrian think the AV is not the AV but the MV, maybe the cross awareness will same as MV. Sometimes for people never know is best, I think. So
Yeah, a very good point there. There is actually lots of debates in terms of whether people should
Mhm.
make aware of what and who they are interacting with. So
yeah,
first of all, if we can see the approaching vehicle has a driver who's looking unattentive or looking or not even there, then immediately or immediate enough that people will then wondering what's happening. Or if AV is very common in that sense, then people will start knowing that it is an AV, despite the AV did not explicitly say that I am an AV, right? So in that situation, then someone would argue that it is better to tell people that I am an AV and it is all right for the driver to look unattentive, right? I'm looking at my phone, but that's not fine because the vehicle is driving itself, is all safe. So in that situation, then someone would argue the other way around. Some people would say that pedestrians or other road users have the right to know that the approaching vehicle is an AV because how they want to interact with AV versus MV, they should be able to make that decisions themselves. If they don't trust AV, then there is no point in forcing people to believe that they are actually, deceive them. They are actually interacting with an MV. But again, then what kind of message should be presented, right? So whether then it is important to say I'm an AV rather than I'm yielding, for instance, or whether we need all of the messages, because then you don't want to have the vehicle which has so many different lights and animated situations going on, right? So in terms of what message is needed, as well as whether we should actually explicitly tell people whether it is an AV or not an AV, it's still, I don't think there is a conclusion. It's all still in research stage, but you can probably see that there is argument from both sides.
yeah.
Right. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my question is more related to the future work you showed because I'm really interested about how to be more inclusive and considering different type of aspects like culture, age, and even some new technologies you just show. So my question is that what do you think? How could we combine the current computer vision technologies to optimize the eHMI design? Because right now, if we do simulation, we can somehow predefine scenarios. But can we do it like real time and using this computer vision technologies to help us understand the intents from different participants?
Thank you. Again, another good question. So we are working on a project EU funded called High Drive, and we have different work packages as well as SP. So we also have in our group, we have a computer vision guy who's called Mardi, and what he's doing is to trying to understand from the computer visions and AI perspective, trying to recognize pedestrians' intention to cross, for example, as well as detecting the pedestrians and so on. So a lot of these research are still very preliminary in terms of their ability in that kind of judgments or recognition. But there isn't much going on in terms of discriminating whether that pedestrian is an older pedestrian and we need more time for that one versus that's a disabled pedestrian or that's a children or that's an old age. And similarly speaking, there isn't much in terms of experimental studies which look at how different user groups actually affect their crossing behavior, because cognitively speaking, as well as physically speaking, they are actually very distinctive. There could be a very wide range of humans' capability in making judgments as well as crossing, right? So not only from the computer vision's point of view, but also from the modeler's point of view, I think all of these should be taken into account. And I think the entire research space is pretty much lacking from computer vision's experimental studies as well as the modelers. And yeah, that should really be taken into account. I know I've said this probably a few years now, but none of the studies have not many of the studies still looking at this, but hopefully we are soon enough there.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Any questions from the online audience or the on-site? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, hello, Yee Mun. I'm Giancarlo from Toyota. I have a question about, did you consider different kinds of eHMI? So I remember some years ago, there were discussions like we should not inform pedestrians like you can cross the road now, but we should rather tell them, oh, I see you.
Yeah. So in the very, very early stage, we did compare or look into 3 different messages. So for instance, I have seen you, I am yielding, not you can cross. We never do you can cross. We're just saying I am yielding. And the third message is I am an AV. So there is a study there which we look at how different eHMI designs actually which one is better in communicating these three different messages. But for some reason, the entire trend of the research area has gone into I am yielding kind of message, rather than I am an AV versus I've seen you. I have seen you we can open up another conversation, and that can take me another hour in describing the challenges of I have seen you, or I've detected you, or I'm yielding for you, not you, or you and you. You know, that kind of message, very specifically trying to portray the message to a specific road user. I think that's the main challenge, and I think I am yielding is sort of a message that is trying to solve the very initial problem of interaction, driver encountering a pedestrian, giving a hand gesture saying that you can, go. And that is the initial reason why we have started looking at I'm yielding more than the other messages. I'm not saying that all the other messages is not important. They might be even more important than I'm yielding, or more suitable than I'm yielding. It's all still in the research state, but that's the reason why this is being investigated the most.
Okay, thank you very much.